Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's extended day-ahead market technical workshop. My name is Keone Almeida. I'm the Manager of Stakeholder Affairs. Today's workshop will focus primarily on the transmission and bucket 3 items. The presentation for today's workshop is available on the initiative webpage. To get to the page, go to caiso.com and navigate to the Stay Tuned or Stay Informed tab. You'll then click on Policy Initiatives, and it will bring you to the main initiative landing page, where you'll find the link to the EDAM webpage. Can you move to the next slide, please? Candace, can you move to the next slide?
One moment.
Candace, are you there?
Yes, it's for some reason it's frozen. I'm just reloading it now.
Oh. So let me know when you're ready, Candace.
Apologies for the delay. I should be ready in just one moment.
Okay, just a few reminders before we get started. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Also, the calls are structured to stimulate open dialogue and engage in different perspectives, with the understanding that stakeholders have reviewed the material in advance. In the interest of time, please refrain from repeating or reiterating what has already been said. And if there are any technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. And thanks for joining us, and we look forward to engaging in this discussion today. So please move to the next slide, please. And then instructions for raising your hand. If you are connected to the audio through your computer or use the Call Me option, select the Raise Hand icon located in the top right above the chat window. Press #2 only works if you're dialed into the meeting. And please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comments. You may also send your questions via chat to either Isabel or myself. Also, Ellie Casillas will be joining and taking over as well, so you can send it to her when she's joined, or to all the panelists. And with that, I'll turn it over to Partha. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Keone, and yeah, thank you as well to all the stakeholders for taking the time this morning for our workshop on Bucket 3 transmission. I also really want to thank everyone for their active participation last week related to the Bucket 2 transmission discussion. Related to Bucket 3, we received a lot of constructive feedback related to the proposal, including different alternatives in terms of options that we should be considering for advancing the proposal forward. And I really hope that today's discussion can help both us at the ISO and at the stakeholder community to understand people's positions, start fleshing out some of these proposals in more detail, and really allow for an effective dialogue on constructive solutions as we move forward with different alternatives. As for today's agenda, we're planning to start off with a discussion on Bucket 3 approaches, as well as reviewing some of the comments on stakeholders' positions. The second topic is really looking at sort of the Bucket 3 transmission in a voluntary, a volumetric uplift framework that will allow for hurdle-free transmission to be included as part of the market dispatch, while allowing for appropriate cost recovery for that bucket 3 transmission. And lastly, we have a couple of examples illustrating illustrating particularly the implications of transmission revenue recovery and some of the options there. So, yeah, really appreciate the dialogue so far, and yeah, look forward to a constructive meeting today. If you wouldn't mind switching to the next slide. Yeah, so on slide 5, what we really have, this is really a brief refresher on transmission availability in the EDM, and that's sort of the different bucket contexts for transmission made available between the BA participants. As a reminder, sort of for the 3 buckets, bucket 1 transmission, this is what we were describing, is either firm or conditional firm, and it's really that transmission required to support resource sufficiency obligation resources. Bucket 2 transmission, which is the discussion that we had last Monday, is primarily consists of transmission rights held by transmission customers of the EDM entity or another transmission service provider within the EDM BAA beyond any requirements needed to demonstrate resource efficiency. And just as a reminder, we had a good discussion on Monday on sort of 2 different options associated with that bucket 2 transmission. The first option was, and that was teed up in the straw proposal, was having this bucket transmission be strictly voluntarily made available by transmission customers in order to be optimized in the EDM. And the second option for bucket 2 transmission was to have that bucket 2 transmission automatically included, if not scheduled by the transmission customer ahead of the EDM market. So that was bucket 2 transmission, and now we're really moving to kind of a discussion on the bucket 3 topic. And really kind of the core of the bucket 3 is that, this is really the remaining unsold firm available transmission capacity at interfaces between the EDM BAAs, and that really the key items that we're really discussing as a part of the workshop processes earlier this year, as well as in the paper, is what transmission, how is that transmission made available? What are the cost recovery mechanisms associated with that? One of the options we really focused on was a hurdle approach that we included as a part of the optimization. But then we really sort of teed up more discussion just in terms of different hurdle-free options that allow for more efficient commitment and dispatch as a part of the day-ahead market, while still allowing for appropriate transmission recovery by those transmission providers making that transmission available. Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide. Yep, one more. So this is really kind of highlighting some of the discussion that took place as a part of that hurdle rate approach that was teed up. And again, this was really kind of the primary approach that was discussed originally as a part of the workshop process. And it really kind of had this concept where the transmission costs will be included as a hurdle rate in the optimization, and how we're thinking about it really is an up to rate based on the FERC-approved transmission rate for each BAA. We did recognize as part of the process there was discussion in terms of some of the drawbacks to the hurdle rate approach, particularly around sort of the decreased market efficiency from those hurdle rates. And for those hurdle rates and the pancaking decreasing efficiency. So on to the next slide. Here we're really, I'll pause a second. Yeah, so in terms of the comments we received on the hurdle rate, almost, it says here the vast majority, it really was almost all the stakeholders, advocated that the bucket 3 transmission, really should be hurdle free in order to ensure the most efficient dispatch. The stakeholders recognize that a hurdle approach, particularly if there's a large hurdle rate, creates significant inefficiencies. So you all really encouraged us to look at structures that would minimize or eliminate hurdle rates or other inefficiencies that would distort the market dispatch within the optimization. And when I say the other efficiencies, I think some people point out that depending on how the uplift, if there was sort of an after-the-fact uplift cost, try to make sure that that wasn't distortionary in terms of bidding incentives or how participants have participated in the EDM market, such that while we might eliminate the direct hurdle rate, the uplift cost might create incentives that would provide similar inefficiencies to the hurdle rate. And so that was something that commenters stressed as well. At least in terms of the last bullet, at least I'd note that, one commenter did note that they think hurdle rate would be the simplest approach in the near term as we develop out other options for hurdle-free transmission. But even that one commenter really kind of stressed the fact that, we should explore hurdle-free transmission options as well. And so at least in terms of where we're sort of moving, these are sort of really key positions that help shape our policy. So if you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide, we'll sort of touch base on a few last comments. One of the other things that participants noted was there was a significant difference in potential hurdles between the ISO and the non-ISO hurdle rates, with one commenter sort of pointing out the fact that the ISO bucket 3 transmission under the current rates, would be approximately, $16 a megawatt hour, and that could go up to $20 when the EDM is actually implemented. And I know as well, I think that one of the things in terms of that shaped our thinking and the principles thinking around this was an acknowledgement that some of the initial assumptions about the amount of capacity that would be provided as bucket 1 versus bucket 3 changed, with there being more bucket 3 transmission than originally assumed in terms of what would be sort of supporting the efficient design. So I think at least in terms of the discussion going forward, based on our own internal analysis of the inefficiencies associated with applying a hurdle rate, we're really going to focus the rest of this discussion on different options to obtain hurdle-free transmission in the EDM market. And we're really hoping that eliminating the hurdle rate will increase the efficiency of the market, and hopefully by increasing the overall benefits, there can be a range of transmission cost recovery options where all parties can really be better off relative to a hurdle rate alternative because we've increased the size of the pie sufficiently. So, yeah, we really look forward to that engagement and have appreciated the comments you all provided and some of the alternatives, because I really think that was you all really provided sort of good alternatives that we can discuss in terms of next steps and positions on moving forward with hurdle-free transmission options. And maybe just for the sake of, I might pause there to see if there's any initial comments on sort of the hurdle rate so far. We're going to have a little more discussion just in terms of the reciprocity framework that we teed up, as well as the 3 other options for after-the-fact transmission recovery. But I thought at least it would open the phone for comments and questions so far in terms of the hurdle rates and positions they have. If I misstated someone's positions or someone wanted to elaborate on it, I thought this might be a good time for that. So would you mind opening the phone lines?
You can click the hand icon, which is located just above the chat panel on the right side of your screen. If you have not connected your audio through WebEx, press #2 on your phone.
Martha, I don't see any individuals in the queue or the chat. Please proceed.
Yep, sounds great. Yeah, thank you. So moving to slide number 10. So first, I wanted to kind of give us a reminder on sort of the first hurdle-free approach, which we sort of teed up in the straw proposal as a, quote, a reciprocity approach. And this is really sort of consistent with the current WEIM framework, where all bucket 3 transmission will be available to the EDM hurdle-free to derive benefits. And that the assumption that there are excess benefits sort of up and beyond any foregone bucket 3 revenues. As a part of this, we also kind of noted in the proposal some of the drawbacks, and particularly that there's potential foregone transmission revenues, and that based on the discussions, we anticipated that certain transmission providers will be giving up proportionally more to any benefits that they might have gained. And so there was a desire to at least have a conversation around sort of expanding beyond the reciprocity framework, which really sort of led to the 3 additional options that we'll be discussing later on. And it was, for lack of a better term, that same last comment of sort of the difficulty of building consensus when it's just pure reciprocity, particularly given the expanded dispatch that might occur day ahead versus real time. And that was sort of another comment that we heard from market participants as well. If you wouldn't mind moving to slide 11. So the commenters on the reciprocity framework really had largely similar thoughts to our initial positions. Kind of the first theme we heard was sort of from a number of participants was that pure reciprocity was unlikely to be viable, in the data time frame, given the magnitude of transmission costs. But one commenter in that, I think there's actually more than one commenter pointed out that it would really be preferable rather than looking at simply lost revenues and the associated cost allocations going at that lost transmission revenues, looking more holistically as a part of the overall cost and benefits of joining the EDAM, and that the implication being that these lost revenues might be a fairly small portion of the overall benefits, and that the size of the pie might sort of grow in a manner that in effect just applying reciprocity might be sort of the most simple and most fair approach going forward. So thank you. If you wouldn't mind moving to slide 12. So towards the end of the previous round of workshops, we introduced a few different frameworks where bucket 3 transmission and associated historical transmission revenue shortfalls could be recovered through different types of uplifts. The primary goal was to ensure that the transmission providers were kept whole from a revenue perspective as a result of the EDAM participation, and there wasn't major cost shifts associated with those participations. The ISO indicated a leaning towards this approach that would capture market efficiencies without a hurdle rate and optimization, while simultaneously recognizing historical revenues and the need to have appropriate cost recovery for these revenues going forward. If you wouldn't mind flipping to slide 13. So for a quick summary of the comments and positions, I'd first note that, that there was kind of a number of commenters who really kind of focused on the theme of transmission compensation should be based on cost causation. We agree with this in principle, and we're going to tee up for discussion a number of questions on how accurate can we make these calculations to tie costs to beneficiaries, and sort of what are some of those trade-offs in terms of the overall objectives. a couple commenters, at least in terms of those proposals, suggested that we had three different options laid out, and that there might be some opportunity that to have some sort of blend of the three different options. But they suggested maybe a 50% could work in terms of there's an option that has the transmission cost allocated pro rata to load, and then 25% could be allocated based on the two other bases to the degree that we don't have sort of consensus among the different separate approaches. That might be a way to gain consensus by allowing one or two different options, two or three different options in terms of how those costs are ultimately recovered. We received comments as well, at least in terms from a transparency standpoint, and the goal is really that the expected loss revenue should be transparent to all EDAM participants, and that we should really strive to impose sort of a process that really allows for all participants to see and understand what the data sources are and what the volumes are that would be applied to a hurdle rate going forward. We received customer comments as well. I think that this is kind of maybe touching back on the earlier issue that we should really look for ways to minimize the amount of costs included, particularly if the allocation was being assigned in a manner that might distort the dispatch incentives. And that was sort of a theme that we received was from a number of participants was figuring out a way to minimize the pool of these costs that would be sort of subject to some allocation. And then just as the final commenters, one commenter highlighted that they thought that really all customers, not just load service customers, should be paying for the transmission system, and that the allocation process should go back to generators and power marketers as well, looking to participate and use the EDM marketplace. So if you wouldn't mind moving on to slide 14. So these are kind of the sort of final comments just in terms of the approach 3 for the different options on hurdle rates. And that really kind of the one overall theme was sort of complexity, that they were worried that sort of if it was people said it was overly complex and not transparent, it really could result in sort of an inability for stakeholders to reach agreement just based on the complexity of the implementation and or the complexity of understanding what the cost impacts might be to the different parties. Some, at least in terms of a separate comment from that, some commenters expressed concern just in terms of the shifting nature of the marketplace in the West as a whole, and that transmission providers could rely more on these type of revenues, and this could degrade the sustainability of existing practices from transmission build-out to procurement, and that was at least a common theme that we heard from participants. And then one participant in particular sort of laid out some details, but there was kind of a common theme among participants just in terms of considering how the bucket 3 transmission options would evolve over time. Some participants, and we're going to be highlighting this again later, focused on kind of the evolving use as well as there might be new transmission build-outs and sort of a changing grid, and so should there be a way that this any after-the-fact uplift costs, that the formulation might need to evolve based on sort of new uses and new transmission that should be sort of applied to this type of framework. But there were others that really were sort of looking for the evolution to look more like maybe this type of framework goes away over time, and that there really sort of is a chance to scale it down to where the bucket becomes smaller and smaller. So there's kind of maybe two different perspectives of potentially increasing with more transmission and or sort of changing the allocation based on usage to sort of scaling it back and having less use take place over time. And maybe for the sake of the discussion, maybe I'll see as well for, I provided sort of a high overview of sort of a lot of the comments. I thought that I would sort of give the opportunity before we got into some of the details that people provided on examples if anyone wants to sort of elaborate their positions just in terms of their concerns, I think that we certainly would appreciate that. And if anyone has any sort of questions or feedback as well, certainly I'd like to hear that as well. So maybe we can open the phone lines again and see if there's any questions or feedback to this point.
Questions on the phone?
There's no questions in the chat.
No, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So if we're willing to move to the next slide.
Someone did just raise their hand.
Yep.
Good morning, this is Kanya Dorland. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
I was calling, or I wanted to ask, when you're calculating the compensation for transmission, you said you were looking at the historic revenue, but one issue that's come up, since August 2020 is that there may not be enough transmission to allow for transfers during emergency conditions. So just want to know how transmission upgrades will be compensated to allow for more transfers during summer peak conditions.
Can I understand your question a little bit further? Are you getting at sort of for basically new transmission build-outs? Is that really what your question is focused on?
Yeah, so again, this is Kanya Dorland with the Public Advocate's Office. In our comments, we were talking about the native load needs calculation. That's still unknown. And so, knowing if there's upgrades needed for transmission usage during peak summer months from parties outside of California, we still don't know that. And so if upgrades are needed to accommodate transfers that parties expect, how are those upgrades going to be paid for?
And maybe I'll tee that up for Milos. This seems like a question related to our different initiative primarily. Milos, would you be willing to sort of weigh in here?
Sure. Good morning and thank you. Yeah, I think later in the presentation we'll be talking about in the context of this option 3, what costs really fit into that, and I think this is what you're getting at is what all costs fit into that transmission revenue requirement that can be recovered through the EDAM, and I think we'll talk about certain types of transmission, and I think we can talk about it in the context there. But in a separate initiative, the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative, we're talking about wheel-through priorities and how ATC is calculated, or how excess transmission can be made available for wheel-throughs to establish priorities. So I would defer that discussion there, but I think you're ultimately getting at what transmission costs can be recovered through this transmission revenue requirement process that we're going to be talking about shortly. So I defer it to that, but I don't know that there is the transmission upgrade costs necessarily fit into that. It's more looking at what are the potential historical foregone revenues, and we'll within that discussion, I think we can identify what fits into that bucket. We have a question teed up to figure out what all elements of transmission compensation can fit into the revenue requirement that is recovered through EDAM. So I defer it to that, but I don't think in my mind that transmission upgrade costs necessarily fit into that. But I think we can talk through it when we get to that slide.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you for that. So thank you. Would you mind flipping to the next slide? And I apologize as well. My neighbor's gardener has arrived, so there might be some background noise, so I'll apologize for that in advance. In terms of some of the participants' option 3 proposals, we had kind of 2 options that participants in particular highlighted that we wanted to kind of give sort of a brief overview. We're going to get into some of more of the details, particularly on this first one. But kind of the first option, at least in terms of proposals that would allow for hurdle-free transmission to be made available, but also to have some sort of after-the-fact uplift charge was, and this is really a combination of maybe 2 different participants' options with a little bit of a wrinkle in them, was really to have some sort of marked uplift charge that will be used to offset lost transmission revenues. Those lost transmission revenues, at least as they were defining them, were really those short-term firm sales that would occur and non-term firm sales. And so the concept was that the lost revenue requirement would be first sort of, and we're going to get into the details of this in terms of how we think that this could be implemented, but once those revenues are determined, those costs would be applied on a volumetric basis to all market demand. And they kind of opened that there might be sort of other ways besides market demand to allocate those costs. Maybe it was applying it to market demand and generation. And then they have sort of a couple different options that they sort of teed up for discussion. So we're going to be discussing that a little more under, I think we switched the order, so I apologize for the slide. This is really the first approach that we're going to be discussing when I turn it over to James momentarily. If you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide. And so, at least in terms of there's a second proposal, and this is one that Southern California Edison had teed up, was that it was a very similar proposal to option 1, but really looking at ways to, again, hurdle-free transmission, bucket 3 being made available to the market, was looking to really assign that lost transmission based on historical use rather than simply a allocation mechanism to all load. And that really the concept was, again, all bucket 3 transmission was going to be made available to the market without a hurdle rate. And that, in return, the ISO, working with the EDM entities would identify that revenue. They specifically called out associated with that being bucket 2 transmission, and they proposed a 3-year historical average in terms of determining that bucket 2 transmission, and that would be the transmission that they'd be really looking to sort of keep whole from a revenue perspective. They also called out, and we'll have more discussion on this, that including any transfer revenues as an offset to this cost. And really, the fundamental is that these would be sort of the net revenues that would be subject to an allocation. and that the allocation list as was being proposed, and as we understood from SCE, would be charged to the EDM entities based on their historic use of the bucket 2 transmission, and that there might be sort of a more precise method of sort of identifying that, and the idea would be that all customers except that EDM entity with the charges could be applied based on this historical use of that specific customer's transmission. So that was really kind of the two options those were really the two options that participants laid out in a little more detail, and that at least I'd encourage you all that within the Southern California Edison comments, they have numbers that they would apply to this, and a couple of examples that we found helpful in terms of understanding some of the walkthrough. And there's additional questions just in terms, and we'll get into a little bit later as to what data do we have available, how might we look at historically. What are different options for looking at historically use? But I'll table at least my discussion for now. So again, maybe the caveat that particularly for that first option, we're going to go into sort of more details around that example. Maybe I'll again pause here for a second just to see if there's any stakeholder feedback on this. I'd also always welcome, there's a few parties, at least on the first option, who had proposals that were similar to that. So if anyone wants to weigh in and provide any caveats, or if anyone from SCE wants to describe a little more of the details and some of the pros and cons that they see it around the historical use, I certainly would appreciate that feedback and a little bit more of a discussion around these options right here.
That looks like we do have one caller in the queue.
Hi, this is Jeff Nelson from SCE. Can you all hear me?
We can. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Good morning, and Partha, thank you for putting a slide here. Yeah, just to sort of get the big picture of SCE's proposal. The concept was that transmission owners are currently selling transmission out through this bucket 2 right now. They're getting revenue for it. They're getting money for it. And our basic principle was, well, let's kind of keep them whole to sort of the net transmission revenues that they were getting. So it's kind of like, no pain to join the EDAM because those are the sales revenues will kind of keep you whole. It's kind of strange because even if they join, I understand the current proposal is that they may still be selling transmission. So this tried to look into the fact, okay, so let's sort of take a snapshot of historical revenues we're getting. I forget what we put, 5 million or something. We've picked a number out of the air. Well, as we go forward, the person may still be selling transmission, maybe not as much. Maybe now they're only getting $2 million of revenue and the rest of the transmission sort of being worked in EDAM. So we felt that they had like $3 million of sort of missing revenue from joining the market, but they're also getting transfer revenues that they weren't getting before. And let's just say they were getting $1 million in transfer revenues. So when you net all that together and use 5 as a baseline, they're still selling, and whatever I said, they're getting 2. They're still getting transfer revenues of $1 million. So they're getting $3 million in revenues. They're kind of $2 million in revenue short. And our concept was, let's keep them whole to that $2 million. So net, they didn't really experience any loss in transmission revenues. And we figured that would work for a while. Eventually, flows are going to change, and you're probably going to have to do some sort of refresh. But at least to get people started, they could be kept whole. And like you were saying, the cost allocation, I was like, well, why don't we kind of try to collect that $2 million from the people that are sort of historically were using that transmission? That may be easier said than done, but that was the idea. But it didn't make sense for us to have the BAA charge itself for the revenue it was missing. That kind of is like digging your hole deeper and not filling it in. And that was the idea of, okay, you're going to collect revenue potentially from everybody but yourself to make yourself whole. And for full transparency, the same concept would apply to California ISO and sort of our wheeling revenue. We kind of take a snapshot of our wheeling revenue, keep ourselves whole, and if the wheeling revenue was changing, there'd be a flavor of uplift to sort of keep that historical wheeling revenue full. Okay, so that was the idea, keep people whole after considering the change in the dynamics and using some sort of multi-year average as a baseline with the acknowledgement that over time, we're probably going to have to reset what that baseline should be. We didn't have a specific proposal for that. So thanks again for putting the slide out there.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jeff. I really appreciate your providing more color to it. And maybe there'll be some questions coming your way from others too in terms of how you're thinking about this. But yeah, thank you again.
Well, this is Vijay with WRA.
Your line is muted.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. This is Vijay Satyal with WRA. Can you guys hear me?
No, thank you.
Okay, so I just have a comment on this proposal. I'm not clear on this one, and I think we try to appreciate that even in the proposal, is that when you're looking at historical revenue, you have an existing EIM structure of entities, and you have potentially new participants that will come in the EDAM. So I put in the chat box to share 2 key themes, if you could keep in mind, please, as you try to approach this methodology. One fundamental concern that at least I have personally is how are we going to determine the historical average and what will be the appropriate level? And is the $2 million amount that Jeff just spoke about based on some return estimate to be whole, or would that be different for different entities? The bigger concern I want to just highlight is how are you going to allocate this historical average, and how are you going to adapt or change it over time when we hope, at least joint commenters hope, that you will eventually be phasing this out so you can have efficient and unlimited full use of transmission. So I don't know if my comment makes sense, but it's a comment/feedback reaction. Thank you.
No, your comment makes sense to me. Maybe I'll would you mind it? At least I think I'd give Jeff the opportunity to respond. I think that some of this was sort of focused particularly around the SCE option.
I'm sorry, I missed the nuance of the question. Could you repeat it? It was like, how do we calculate the 2 million? Or I missed what you were saying about the 2 million.
Yeah, how did you? I was just curious, Jeff, on how you came up with that number, $2 million, and maybe that's based on your existing assessment of your transmission use and within the EIM framework, and how transmission is being allocated there post regular CAL-ISO interaction. Or I was just curious on that, but I don't want to get too nerdy on that. My main message was you're developing a historical average approach of calculation with existing EIM entities possibly in mind who would allocate the transmission, but there could be more participants coming through EDAM, and so maybe that could be a lower amount. But even then, how are you going to have historical average data available, and how is that going to be agreed upon?
Yeah, so the 2 million was completely made out of thin air. It was just a number that I could do in my head. There's
okay, I feel better now in Salt Lake City. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, but the idea would be that each balancing authority that was joining that wanted this would have to bring their numbers to the table. They'd have to go to the ISO and open their books and say, okay, here's the transmission revenues, the sales we've had over the last 3 years. They'd averaged, with my hypothetical, 5 million because they opened their books. And then there'd have to be an additional sort of bookkeeping on, well, how much additional sales did you continue to make? So there'd have to be some sort of bookkeeping, book opening between the balancing authorities and the ISO, some sort of attestation or something to make sure that everyone agreed that the numbers coming out of the books were accurate.
Thank you. That helps a lot. I presume that would have to happen, but I didn't want to assume that. So thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, thank you.
And I put in the chat box the two key principles we are hoping if, and I believe option 3 is not used, but if it is, 2 comments we had in the chat box. Thanks.
So thank you for that. And at least in terms of that first issue, at least in terms of calculating the historical average or expected, I think that we're going to have some discussion of that later. I think we recognize the fact that it needs to be consistent, open, and transparent for sort of a common understanding in terms of what is included in these calculations and what is not. And so I think that's sort of, I think for almost any of the options that we're teeing up that would look at ways to make transmission providers whole from including transmission and EDAM, that's sort of a key topic is in terms of, clarity with terms to what the data that's being used, what the process is being used, and to make sure that there's sort of a consistency at minimum in terms of the understanding of what's included and what's not included. Seems like it's critical for any of these options. And so I certainly would agree with that feedback. The question on the historical use and historical average, I think that's one where if there's a desire to go down that, we'd have to have sort of further follow-up on that part of the questions. There's at least a little bit different of a discussion that we'd probably need to tee up. So yeah, thank you again for that comment. And maybe we can move on. I see that there's a couple more comments that Doug and Mike have joined the queue as well.
Hi, this is Doug Bocignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. On the slide that you refer to bucket 3, but then you also talk about bucket 2 revenues. I guess I'm not following. Should it really be talking about lost bucket 3 revenues? Or is the proposal to sort of merge the two in the calculation and look at both bucket 2 and bucket 3?
I have my interpretation of how this would work because I think you're really focusing on sort of this write-up of what SEE said, so maybe I'll allow Jeff to respond instead of my giving sort of how I interpreted it. Jeff, are you willing to raise your hand again?
Yeah, hold on. How do I do it?
Well, you're already speaking, so
we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Duh. Sorry, guys. Hey, Doug. Is this thing on? Yeah, we debated this internally, and, I was the most stubborn in the group. Anything that gets sold and makes money on a forward basis, I considered to be bucket 2. So bucket 3 was anything that wasn't sold, right? The bucket 3 is the unsold transmission that just gets turned over. So if it's unsold in bucket 3, well, it wasn't generating you revenue. My view of bucket 2, if you sold it, anywhere in advance, it was generating you revenue, and that's the sort of revenue we try to keep people whole.
So it sounds like you're kind of looking at both then, right? Because
bucket 3 is unsold, so we're not going to give people money for unsold transmission.
Right, but then you're putting into bucket 2 anything they sell, even if it's on a very short-term basis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's how I understand the EDAM proposal works. Once they sell it, they can sell it on a very short-term basis, day before delivery, and then that transmission becomes sort of the right of the person that bought it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my initial reaction is I can see the appeal of the idea of looking at, how has the resource typically been used and compensated in the past, and, not wanting to upset that with EDAM. But I wonder if there's a way that you could how do I want to say this? I think the risk of this approach is that if the value of the transmission exceeds the cost, then people will preferentially renew their rights for the valuable transmission and migrate away for the transmissions that's less valuable than the cost. And so maybe that's what already happens today. So maybe that's no different. But I think it's something you would want to think through. So
Yes. So Doug, that's why we wanted to look at a historical snapshot and say, okay, what was your historical usage, and use that as the baseline. Flows may change, right? Transmission that's valuable today that people really wanted to buy today and probably did buy, with resource changes, market changes, all the load, whatever, that may not be valuable transmission in the future. And absent EDAM, it may generate no revenue. So that gets into, well, how do you refresh the baseline? See, we think it's pretty easy to start with a baseline, a historical snapshot. But as things evolve, we do think it would need to be refreshed, and we don't have a proposal on how to refresh it. And I think the refreshing is getting to your concern. We don't lock it in for all of time.
yeah, no, I think this is worth pursuing. It seems like an interesting concept.
No, thank you, Doug. Any further questions?
Hi, everyone. This is Mike Whitney with NCPA. It's an interesting proposal. I guess a concern is that it's been out there for a while, but we haven't seen any hard data yet. I saw a snapshot of a spreadsheet a couple months back, but apparently it needed work. So it's hard to really get behind that proposal without having a better understanding of how it's going to be calculated, what kind of money's out there. And then there's a question of, are EDAM entities, external to the CAISO, are they just going to be paying each other? Or is it mostly going to be borne from CAISO, potentially subsidizing the EDAM entities at a significant cost to the CAISO ratepayers? And then there's, the fact that the real-time bilateral markets are already drying up with WEIM, and clearly see that the day-ahead bilateral markets are going to dry up with EDAM, and so there'll be less opportunity for potentially for those transmission owners and operators to market that in bilateral markets, and they'll still be able to market it, potentially to sell it to other entities for their RSE, or show it to the CAISO and get the transfer revenues from it. So those are just some concerns that we've been mulling over. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And I'll table a response to your first question now. We have some data that we'll be providing through the examples of what here is really that first option in terms of basically a different transmitted cost recovery option where we have some data. We don't have data included for every possible transmission provider based on their lost revenues and uses, but I think we'll get into that a little more where we have some information, and that maybe you can re-tee up that question at that time if we don't provide sufficient information here. So what additional data would be helpful? Yeah, we'd appreciate that discussion. So yeah, well, I don't see any more questions in the queue. Any questions in the chat, Kenny?
No question.
No question.
Thank you. Yeah, so maybe we can move on to the next slide. So we'll touch briefly on some of the additional suggestions, and I'm going to pause again after these just because I think that they might warrant more discussion, or at least I want to provide that opportunity as well. A couple different stakeholders suggested that the ISO explore an alternative for compensation mechanisms such as a zonal approach, and that the parties advocate that having a zonal rate approach really could reduce significant rate pancaking issues while allowing for appropriate cost recovery. We really appreciate that the comments here. I think that I'd welcome if anyone wants to sort of expand just in terms of how the zonal approach rate would work. Two different parties had sort of brought up this type of proposal and concept, but without much details fleshed out. And so, yeah, we'll in a moment I'll sort of seek if anyone wants to sort of elaborate on that zonal rate concept. And the second one was really that looking for that parties had suggestions of looking for additional compensation for entities providing wheel throughs to the markets above and beyond the volume of imports and exports. And I think that the commenters who are at least the one commenter that made this was really sort of acknowledging the fact that those entities providing, if there are sort of specific entities that aren't really net exporters or importers, where primarily their transmission is used to wheel through, they might not have the same levels of benefits, but they might be foregoing a significant amount of historical revenue requirement, and so that there should be sort of additional focus on those parties that might be sort of used to wheel through their systems. If you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide. And maybe, yeah, thank you. So continuing on that theme in terms of the discussion, at least I kind of would highlight that I think that what we're discussing these options going forward, I think that we're really kind of looking at really the different options for revenue requirements that are being, by the way, is this that next slide? Or we flip? I think we've gone maybe too far. So I apologize. Yeah, you flip back one more. And maybe before I move on, I offer the opportunity for people to speak up on the zonal transmission rate. And so maybe this would be a good time to pause and at least open the phone lines to see if anyone wanted to expand some of the thinking in terms of that zonal rate before we move forward with that discussion.
As a reminder, for questions, you can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx, or if you've joined via audio only, please press #2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first. Partha, I'm not seeing any individuals in the queue or the chat at this time. Please proceed.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, that would you wouldn't mind for moving forward to slide 19. Yeah, so this is really kind of, we're going to get into a few examples, and this is really kind of maybe setting up that next discussion where I'm going to turn over to James on maybe more of some numerical examples in terms of two options for historical recovery. But this is really kind of maybe first slide is really kind of level setting sort of the purpose of that revenue recovery, and that we're really looking for opportunities to, as we discussed before, keep transmission providers whole and to ensure that historical revenue recovery and sort of as we evolve is continues to be appropriate for different transmission providers making their transmission available. We're also, as we're incorporating them, we're assuming that the OAT sales will continue and that we're looking for different ways to factor in sort of ongoing transmission sales, decreasing the amount of uplift costs that are needed to make specific transmission customers whole because they are continuing to make those sales, and that should be one factor should be included into the market. Yeah, and Luce, as participants have already alluded to, I think the last bullet is really touching on, the step one in almost all these processes really requires a clear, transparent determination of the revenue requirements and making sure that we have a apples to apples comparison that's clear to all participants on what those transmission costs that should be recovered through the EDAM marketplace. If you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide. So here are sort of a few of the key questions that we've been considering when looking at sort of the various alternatives. And we'd be interested in hearing from you all as well if these are the right questions. Some of these, we really sort of, most of these we kind of heard as sort of within your comments as sort of issues that you were considering, and that we'll have sort of a separate discussion on each one of these topics with respect to the different proposals, and we'd be really interested in more of your feedback. But I won't go through these in details, mainly because a lot of this discussion has already taken place and more will take place. But kind of the first main question was really, what are the historical revenues that need to be recovered? Second, we're looking at sort of what are the mechanisms, how should the revenue be recovered in the EDAM? And that's really where it kind of moved from potentially from a hurdle rate approach to maybe some sort of after the fact uplift costs. And then sort of the next point really, and I think that this was kind of a key point for the discussion going forward, is how is the collective revenue allocated to ensure that, as discussed earlier, that's really being allocated on a fair and equitable basis going forward. The fourth question we'll be considering, this really will overlap potentially with tomorrow's discussion on transmission, on transfer revenues, as well as, can transfer revenues associated with bucket 3 being used to offset historical recovery? Is that sort of an appropriate use of those transmission revenues? And then there's sort of various questions just in terms of sort of the administrative processes. I think we'd have to have sort of more discussion just in terms of ensuring the confidence of the data, making sure that we have clarity in terms of the timing of submissions and settlements. And that's, I think part of the discussion that will need to be happening is, we've been looking into some of the numbers and some of the, the FERC data that's provided, and trying to make sure that we really understand and have a common understanding in terms of what that data is and what does it look like today and what should be included in the recovery mechanism. And then the last one, I think that people have already sort of teed up this discussion just in terms of how should this transmission source revenue shortfalls be adjusted over time. And that will likely be a key discussion topic, particularly as uses change as well as new transmission developed. So I thought someone might be weighing in, so I thought I'll pause for a second. Okay. We're going to flip to the next slide. We're almost ready for the sort of the more meaty discussion, just in terms of some of the examples. But I thought at least I'd sort of tee up, and I think that this is sort of teeing up how we're thinking about the transmission revenues. Jeff and Doug just had a good discussion around this earlier, but really the kind of the main bucket that we were sort of focused on in terms of creating our examples was those historical revenues that were sort of foregone potentially by making transmission available to the EDAM marketplace. And kind of the first one was kind of the short-term firm transmission sales, where the bucket 3 would no longer be utilized, and that could contribute, and that instead be made available to the EDAM market, which could lead to a potential shortfall in the overall revenue recovery. And the second one was really not particularly non-firm transmission sales, where if unscheduled firm transmission that was sort of already sold to customers with bucket 2 historically was made available to the market to the oat market for sales, and that led to non-firm sales resulting in sort of revenues that offset the overall cost. But now instead that transmission is just optimized as a part of the EDAM market. That type of non-firm transmission revenue was something else that we thought we should initially thought should be included, but at least we want to sort of tee that up for discussion as well, and hear your all's opinions on that component. And at least for the ISOs, I think the way we're looking at it was sort of the foregone revenue really might be up to the total annual WAC revenues associated with the ISOs export and wheeling transactions. And so if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. So this one as well, I think we've had some good discussion on this, but this really kind of tees up kind of a number of different ways, and we're going to get into some of the specifics around this. So this is really providing some of the initial thought in terms of that question of there's probably really a variety of ways in which the historic road shortfalls could be recovered and allocated to customers. You know, it could be to gross load across the footprint. There could be something that really focused, as one commenter says, to measured demand and supply, where generations recovering a portion of that. And then the last one, at least as sort of the discussion from SCE, there could be some basis based on historical transmission usage, but we've sort of recognized that for that example, it could get more complex. And so as we go through the examples, I think you'll sort of see a little more of the data around what the impacts might be to rates and to the overall uplift costs by using these different mechanisms. We can have more of a discussion on are there any one of these that participants really feel like there's the right method, or there's sort of pros and cons to the different methods that people want to focus in on. So in terms of I think there's one last slide before we get to the examples. Actually, we moved that to the end. So we're going to sort of come back to some of those last slides, but maybe I'll turn over to James Lynn now to sort of walk through some of those examples that we're thinking about in terms of transmission revenue recovery, and then we'll circle back to some of the remaining policy questions and have more of a discussion around sort of teeing up those options. So, James, are you ready, and should I turn this over to you?
Partha, yeah, before we turn it over to me, it looks like Doug Boccioni has a hand raised, and then and we may want to address this question first.
Yep, sounds great.
Doug Boccioni for BAMX. You know, you made the point that for the ISO, the foregone WAC revenues may be the part that may be at risk, but it seems to me that it really depends on what the transfer revenue sharing allocation is. And with the preferred approach of CAISO, that, you know, with limited exceptions, the ISO would not share in transfer revenues. I think that statement is correct, but if the ISO actually also shared transfer revenues like all the other EDAM participants, then I think there's a good chance that the ISO share of those sort of to offset the lost wheeling out revenues, you know, it could exceed that. But, you know, if the ISO isn't going to share in the transfer revenues, then I think that statement is probably true. But, you know, I think if you do what I would think is a more equitable sharing of the revenue, transfer revenues, I think that would help address that problem.
Thanks, David. I'll let James respond. We're flipping back 2 slides just so we're, for the sake of other participants, we always have the right. Yeah, this is maybe one more. So I apologize. Yeah, so thanks. James, I think this is probably you were about to weigh in. I assume. I think you're the right person.
Yeah, I was. So, Doug, yeah, good question, and I think we're going to address that more tomorrow during the transfer revenue discussion. We're going to go in more details on the distribution of transfer revenues across the BAAs. So I don't want to preempt that discussion here. But we're also thinking tomorrow we should discuss a little bit when it comes to the sub-allocation of transfer revenue. What is it? Is it something that should offset the transmission costs, or is it more like congestion rent that can be distributed to measure demand load or the transmission customer? I think the best place to have those discussions probably is tomorrow when we're actually discussing transfer revenue.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe we just keep in mind the linkage, the potential linkage back on this issue when we have it.
Yeah, and actually, Jeff and you both have raised a distinct linkage here between the transfer revenue and potential recovery of the transmission revenue requirements, which make this a very linked proposal here. So, yeah, I have noted that.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And it actually feeds very well into my presentation on the examples. So if we can move forward, I think it's 3 slides. Yeah, here. So what we try to do here is partly describe the 2 basic methodologies in which we are looking to recover the potential converted transfer revenue rights. And what this is these are the short-term firm sales, non-firm sales, and the ISO wheeling revenue that we think is going to be converted into transfer energy between BAAs, and thus will be lost as bilateral market sales or compensated through exports out of the ISO. And we've identified right now as 2 particular options that we are reviewing. One is a volumetric uplift charge of actual converted TRR revenue, and the second one is the volumetric charge for forecasted converted TRR revenue. There's a couple assumptions that are being made here just for simplicity and demonstration purposes. One is I don't account for transfer revenue in this because, as I said with Doug, is that it's probably a discussion that's better held off for tomorrow, and we can address that and see if this needs modifications from there. The other thing that I've done is we made the assumption that it is a EDAM area rate that is going to be applied. So basically, that the turning over the bucket 3 transmission or unsold transmission for use in the market has uniform benefits across the entire EDAM footprint, and therefore we're going to have a uniform rate that would be applied to as an uplift. Now, we can look at the idea of a BAA specific rate, but in these slides, I addressed it as a uniform rate for now. And so as we talked, in part to kind of outline why we are looking at these particular items as forecasted converted transmission revenue requirements, I'm just call TRR from this point forward, revenue, is we went out and looked at the various different BAAs, their short-term firm, non-firm sales, and we've come up with an anticipated number between $125 million to $300 million. The reason for such a wide range is that only a portion of this sales will be potentially converted during the EDAM onboarding and as we do the optimization. We will continue to have bilateral sales. So when we did our assumptions here in our demonstration, I made the assumption that all of these short-term firm and non-firm sales were converted and not just a portion, just to make it a little bit simpler. So this is a high-level estimate. I did the same thing with the ISO wheeling revenue. I made the assumption that all of the wheeling revenues of interties associated with the WEIM BAAs are converted into potentially loss or transfer revenue, and therefore it needs to be recovered through converted CRR. So again, this is a very high level discussion, and to make it even simpler, and when we go into the next slides, I've actually pared it down a little bit more. I pared it down to 4 BAAs, and these 4 BAAs, I was able to confirm the numbers and was able to, get confirmation from the BAAs that these are actual short-term non-firm sales that will potentially be converted using the transfer revenue, transfer energy. So my first discussion, I'm going to start on the easier one. It's going to be on the volumetric charge for forecasting converted TRR revenue. So we can go to the next slide. And then one more. So the volumetric uplift charge for forecasted revenue, you're going to calculate, first off is your forecasted converted TRR revenue. And then from that, we are going to calculate a volumetric rate associated with that forecasted TRR. This volumetric rate is going to be the same across all BAAs, but it's going to be dependent upon what we choose as the transaction volume. So we can use gross load, we can do gross measured demand, or it should say gross supply plus demand. I think I deleted something by accident. But in essence, it's going to be all transactions. As we increase the transaction volumes from load to include, to eventually get into all of transaction, you'll see that the rate significantly decreases per the entire footprint. And so the volumetric rate, again, is the forecasted converted TRR revenue over the transaction volume. And as I stated earlier, recognizes a shared benefit for releasing the bucket 3 transmission. If we can go to the next slide. The next slide gives us an example of what are the forecasted converted TRR revenues that I used. As I said, there were a couple BAAs where I was able to confirm their short-term and non-firm sales, and as well as the ISO. And for the ISO, I broke it down a little further into the wheeling revenue that was lost associated with these particular BAAs that I was able to confirm the sales with. So how you can potentially come up with this, you can use previous year's gross export transfers to determine if I have this many transfers, and we have our own internal BAA rate, this would be the amount of loss, short-term and non-firm sales. Basically, this is the sales that was converted by the EDAM market, and this is what I need to recover through the uplift instead of through another mechanism. The second way of doing it is you estimate your short-term firm sales and non-firm sales that you expect to be lost and actually converted. And the reason why I have them a little bit differently is the previous year gross export transfer focuses more on what the market actually optimized and used, where the second methodology is more along the way Jeff described it. We're using historical to come up, this is what our sales was, and even if the market doesn't use all of it, we have the potential to recover all that forecasted TRR, converted TRR revenue. If we can go to the next slide. So as I said, this is the simpler of the two approaches. You basically are going to take the total forecasted converted TRR revenue and divide it by your total gross load plus measurement. Oh, sorry, I have to update here. Or gross supply. You'll see the numbers changed, but the header didn't. I need to update the headers. I apologize for that. So the option one is to meter load. You see that the total gross meter load was 337.25 million megawatt hours. And if I take the forecasted converted TRR dollars and divide it by the total gross metered load, it comes out to a rate of 0.338. Now, this is a rate per megawatt hour, and then so each BAA is going to pay their portion of the total converted rights, and this is to ensure that the PTO and TSP, the PTO or the transmission service provider are fully compensated. And since we can't paint megawatts, we're assuming that all load benefits from this, and therefore this rate is applied to all meter load. A similar concept is for measure demand. And with measure demand, it's load plus export. You'll see that it actually increases a little bit more, and this was a little more difficult to estimate, but we looked at the exports that maintained at the ISO boundary, as well as the exports that were base scheduled as part of WEIM to come up with a approximation of what we believe the gross measured demand would be. So it increases the denominator by nearly $32 million, or 32 million megawatt hours to 370.5 million megawatt hours. This then, in essence, reduces your overall EDAM area footprint rate to 0.308. And thus, you'll also see that there's a shift a little bit on the collection of the converted TRR revenue, because the more exports you have, you can have the transfer energy or that energy that's being shifted to your area be served for load or to serve an export that was base scheduled. And then the third option is you apply it to everybody, demand plus supply. Now, obviously, when you do demand plus supply, you're nearly doubling your meter load or your measured demand, because you are now adding into this element your generation plus your imports. And so then when you look at it, your EDAM area rate then drops to 0.151. This makes it a much lower rate to apply to everybody, and you'll see a little bit of a cost shift again. So the more supply that was added by a BAA increases their where we're going to collect it from. Now, if we go to the next slide.
By the way, James.
Yep.
I was going to highlight. There's a question in the queue. I don't know if you want to take it right now.
So I was going to do the summary and then go to questions. So thank you, Partha.
Yeah, thanks, James.
Yeah. So basically, the make whole uplift is to transaction volumes. So it is taking the converted TRRs or forecasted converted TRRs, and we are spreading it across the entire EDAM footprint using potentially metered load, metered gross measured demand, or gross supply plus gross demand. Again, this assumes that the TSP is not being harmed because we will compensate the TSP at their forecasted converted TRRs once we have collected it from the actual volumetric rate pairs. And it eliminates the need for a hurdle rate and has kept the historical TRR perspective whole. They also recognize the shared benefit across using by turning over transmission that the entire EDAM footprint shares in the benefit of the more transmission, and therefore we're sharing in the compensation for the forecasted TRR revenue. I will stop here, and I think, Ken, you have a question?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Ken.
Thanks for taking my question. So I'm a little less concerned now that I followed the slides. I see that it is a calculation of one rate for the entire EIM area, or perhaps it's for the entire set of EIM BAs that are participating in EDAM rather than one rate per BA. So I like that, but I wonder if you would venture a prediction or a guess or a guesstimate of to what degree would you say that this could result in EIM BAs essentially funding their own TRRs?
So if I didn't put it in here, but if you did a comparison, you have the potential, yes, that you are not necessarily funding your own TRRs, that you may be funding a portion of it. And that's because we are benefiting by the fact that the transmission is being turned over, so we potentially, a BAA potentially could be getting more energy from another BAA using the transfer ETSRs instead of having to use its own generation to serve its load. And so that's part of the reason why we identify it as a shared benefit is the market optimization is potentially going to move resources around and use the transfer, and that's going to be more or less, and that's what we're going to kind of get into more on the second option. And it shows that everybody is benefiting by it, and therefore we were looking at the option of distributing this across. Now, I was going to get to the end is Jeff kind of discussed the idea of a BAA by BAA rate and distributing it to the other BAAs based upon their measure demand load or whatever transaction volume we determine. That is possible, but then what that creates is a very distinct rate for each BAA when it comes to both what we're compensating the PTO and TSP for, as well as who's collecting. And so you now are reducing the shared benefit of having all that transmission made available, because one of the problems we have is I can't paint the megawatt, so I can't say that the change in the generation's output says that BAA 5 should get, or BAA 3 should pay for it, not BAA 1. So we're saying it benefits everybody because the energy is flowing through and can sync to any of the BA's load. A long-winded answer.
I understand.
I hope I answered it.
No, I think I'm getting there. I understand the premise that all BAs benefit from this, and that I don't disagree with that. And I understand that you can't barcode the electrons, and so you don't know exactly which. You can't get extremely tricky with the allocation methods, but we do in EIM currently see, to varying degrees, a lot of charge codes that are primarily funded by the BA itself. I think the primary offender would be the BCR, right? Where it looks like you're getting money, but in fact you pay for 95% of that all by yourself. So maybe you're not really getting any BCR. And other charge codes, maybe to a lesser degree. And I just wondered if we're already headed down that path for transmission revenue rights and EDAM.
Yeah, it's a little bit, and I know what you mean by big cost recovery. The big cost recovery is similar for the real-time market for WAM is how do you know which generator was being dispatched to serve another area's load? And so we had to do a little bit of the rough justice, if you want to call it, where we determined the transfer net transfer out determines how much of that BCR gets shifted to other BAs, to a sinking BA. That creates then a similar toward to do the BA by BA rate. You would then determine how much the transfer revenue was collected in one BAA, and then you would have to distribute to those other BAAs, and then it starts creating a separation on the rate and who's paying for it. And so it could have a bigger shift. I mean, it could have a shift in dollars, but it's not going to be a huge shift in dollars from the way I can determine it right now.
Yeah. So the trigger, the warning sign that I look for is BA load. When it looks like the BA load may be the elephant in the denominator, if you will, that
correct.
In essence, that's going to dominate where the money comes from. And I would encourage, if there's not some tricky way to identify a certain behavioral type of determinant that helps assign money based on collect money based on causation, that if there is a way to include generation and load and the interchange elements of measured demand to diminish the extent to which that just becomes a left-hand, right-hand payment from and to the BA.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad we're having this discussion, Ken, because I was going to tee this up for discussion even after we do the second possible way of collecting this, because there's three areas that need to be discussed. One is the benefits of basically a uniform rate across the EDAM footprint. What is the methodology in which we are collecting the converted rights? Should it be to metered load, measured demand, or as you had suggested, to total transaction? And then the next part would be is included in there is there any distinction on the types of energy that has been of those groupings? Is it to apply to everybody, or is there a specific reason to exclude one party or another?
Probably not a completely appropriate time for this comment, but it's been in the back of my mind for several weeks. Has anyone ever considered an alternative which would essentially treat transmission made available to EDAM exactly the same as CRRs? Granted, that would remove the safety net that I think you're trying to build in, that sometimes CRRs won't have value if there isn't any congestion on that path. But is there an alternative that simply just increases the bucket of CRRs with donated transmission and uses all the existing mechanisms to fund them?
The CRR discussion, we had original CRR discussion during the working groups. Now, we potentially can take this back and have additional discussions on it. But I believe the stance for the initial implementation of EDAM was that CRRs was not necessarily going to expand into the other EDAM BAs at this time, and that it is something that we may be part of your the transition that was referenced earlier, is that maybe we can transition this mechanism off as the potential CRRs come on, and you can replace it with the CRR that you're referencing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any other of my colleagues on the panel have any comments. I'm hearing crickets. I think if you don't have any other questions, Ken, I'll move on to Jeff.
Okay, well, thanks for indulging me. I understand that building in the protection of guaranteeing expected revenue from the transmission kind of precludes treating it just like any other CRR, but I think it also may be sort of creating a second class of transmission that just isn't treated with the same value as other transmission, when in fact I don't think the electrons care.
Right.
They'll take either path.
Okay, so we've noted that, and we'll have probably more internal discussions on that as well as external discussions then.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Jeff, I believe you have your hand raised.
There we go. I think you can hear me now. Jeff.
Hi,
Nelson.
Jeff.
Hi again. Jeff Nelson, SE. Hey, I wanted to focus on, I know you're going to get to it, the BA specific versus the non-specific. And I wanted to just share the thought processing, and it was a really good conversation that just happened there. And the key there was sort of the load becomes sort of a driving factor and determines how much costs get allocated. You know, even in a case where something like everybody joins, and I'm going to appeal to people's sense of sort of like fairness and, you know, equity instead of their sense of cost shifting in this conversation. Even if everyone joins, California is still going to be something like 40 to 50% of the load in the market. And if not everyone joins, California is going to be sort of, you know, dominant amount of load. So you just got on the surface that California is going to be picking up a bunch of costs, just no way around it. But then the sort of the thought experiment was, well, let's just do this thought experiment that California loses 100% of its wheeling revenues. And its costs are sort of allocated back to it. And let's just say it's 50% of the load. Well, the net effect there was that the benefits that our California transmission customers were getting just got cut in half, because even if they are sort of being compensated based on some benchmark or some historic time, they're then turning around and picking up half of the costs. So just on its surface, that really troubled us. And that led us to our first principle of, look, we don't mind paying for benefits we're getting. We think it's fine. It's good to pay for benefits we're getting. So that means we should be paying for the transmission that other people are bringing to the table. But it doesn't make sense for us to pay for our own costs. So we really put that as a first principle of rule number one: a balancing authority doesn't pay for its own transmission costs. And then everything else can sort of flow. And then there's a question of, do you do a simple allocation where you pull everything together, or do you do something like we were proposing to try to allocate cost causation? And I realize that's complicated, and this is certainly the one step away from our proposal is, okay, you stick with the rule that no balancing authority pays for itself, and then you figure out what to do with allocation from there. But I think because of the disproportionate size of California under any circumstance, that we really have to have balancing authority by balancing authority rights to make this equitable. So I'll just leave it there, and as we walk through the numbers, hopefully people can sort of think about that argument as we talk.
Okay, Jeff. Now there is something that I'll have to do then, is on the next example, as I still assume a uniform rate. So internally we had discussed this yesterday, and we did recognize, based upon your answers, that this request may come. So I will develop a BA by BA rate and put it into these type of slides, and I will present it or publish it out to everybody in a couple days. It's going to take me a few iterations to make sure I have it correct. that I can show what the difference is between the uniform rate and the BAA specific rate.
Could you go back to your BAs that you're looking at? And I want to see if it shows sort of the lack of comparability in size of one of the BAAs. I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Yeah, so can we go back, I think it's one slide? Yes, so I have one BAA is significantly larger than everybody else.
Okay, that'll show the principle. Okay, thank you.
But it also shows a little bit is when we get into everybody, you can see that yes, BAA also increases, but also does some of the other BAs. So there is a shift that BAA is not paying as much because the generation that potentially is serving BAA is coming from one of the other BAAs as well. So that's why I wanted to put these three tables together so we could see or get an indication of how as we add the various megawatts and start including supply, you can see that you are leveling out the playing field a little bit by including the generation and imports.
And I'm just not a fan of allocating stuff to generators, just as an aside, because then it becomes sort of an additional marginal cost of participation.
Agreed. It's got something that they'll eventually incorporate in their bid. I agree. But I thought it was best to show how we can minimize the impact. But thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so we'll move on to the next option. Now, the next option is it's more of a true-up option, and it's called the volumetric uplift charge for actual converted TRR revenue. So I'm going to do a high level. What this is going to accomplish is it starts off again with the forecasted converted TRRs. You use the forecasted converted TRR revenue to calculate would be a volumetric rate that we're going to apply to actual gross export transfers. So in order to do this, you have to estimate what your losses were. You would use, as I said previously, if you don't know what your gross export transfers are, you potentially would have to estimate the rate based upon your loss, short-term sales, and non-firm sales, that capacity. So you calculate a uniform rate. That uniform rate would then apply to the actual gross export transfers, and you'll come up with your actual converted TRRs. This tells us exactly of what you estimated, what was used by the market. And this potentially can allow us to do a true up from what was expected to be converted and not sold to that which was actually sold as part of the bilateral market, and the rest was converted by the EDAM. It'll be distributed to the TSPs in proration to their forecasted converted TRRs over the total, and then you will collect it similarly as we did in example one, either from the metered load, measured demand, or total transaction volumes. And as I put in the bottom, there's a potential need for a true-up. Now, I'm going to discuss this potential need for a true-up from both the option, the forecasted distribution versus the actual converted TRR distribution, because there is a potential need for a true-up for both, and there's a mechanisms that we potentially could use. So we can go to the next slide. So in this example, I'm going to walk through what we did. I used the same forecasted volumes that I did in the first option, but then I turned around and I looked at these BAA's actual transfers, and I calculated the gross export transfers across from the prior year and came up with a forecasted converted TRR rate. So this forecasted converted TRR rate basically took $114 million of forecasted converted TRRs divided by your forecasted gross export transfers. And this comes a rate of $2. This $2 is not what's going to be collected. This $2 rate is used to derive what was actually converted. And so if we go to the next slide, what we did is we took that $2 rate and I looked to see in this year what was the transfers that was actually optimized by the market and applied the $2 rate to that to say this was actually should have been collected. This was our true lost converted CRRs. And what you can see is that in this particular scenario, this year had a higher amount of transfers than the prior year. So we went from 56 to 57 million megawatt hours, which then increased the gross transfer revenue from 114 million to 115.5 million dollars. So this allows us to do a true up. You're basically trying to true up from what was forecasted to what was actually converted. And so if we go to the next slide. So what we would do here then is because we are truing up, I need to distribute this true up amount back to the BAAs that had estimated their converted rights. And so what we did is we used their forecasted CRR converted rights, not CRR, TRR converted rights against the actual. So I take my actual and I do a proration based upon what they provided as their forecasted converted TRR revenue. And so what ends up happening is each BAA gets paid a little bit more because in an aggregate, I collected a little bit more. And then this collection, then, you know, who are we going to collect it from is the next element. And at this point, we went back to a similar methodology is in the first example. We go to the volumetric rates of the load, measured demand, or total supply. So we go to the next slide. And I did the same thing on the headers. So as you can see now, what this did, because we converted more of the sales than was anticipated, we end up having a higher rate by metered load. It went from 0.338 to now 0.342. So now because we're going to have to collect more, the metered load is going to have to be charged a little bit more. And then the same thing would happen with measured demand. It goes up to 0.312. I think it was originally 0.308. And then if we did to total transactions, it went from 0.151 to 0.153. Now, the benefits of this, if we can go to the next slide, is that it actually looks at what was truly converted. And in this case, because we looked at what was truly converted, there is a surplus. Now, again, if we converted less, there potentially be a shortfall. So there has to be a true-up mechanism in place. Now, as we talked about this, it was determined that also, or noticed that the original one also required a potential true-up. The true-up would be from the EDAM entity would have to do the true-up mechanism. But there's two ways we can do this. Actually, there's three. You apply the shortfall or surplus to the next year and say, if I over-collected, that means my adjustment or what I believe is being converted I've already collected a portion of it ahead of time, so therefore I'm going to reduce my forecasted converted TRR revenue and thus show that the benefits of collecting more from the prior year. The second option is to resubmit your forecasted converted TRR in alignment or more in alignment with your actual converted or adjusted for your surplus, and then you would then have an adjusted rate that would flow through our normal settlement cycle. This is assuming that you have an idea of what your difference is by your final statement for the recalculation statement in essence. And then when you resubmit, we will do a T plus 12 month or a T plus 21 month recalculation to show that you have submitted revised numbers for forecasted TRRs. So this would follow the normal settlement cycle, and that way you can keep the dollars in the appropriate year. The third option, which I don't like putting it on here, but I will mention it, is a true-up mechanism at the end of the year. And what that means is I basically take the difference between the actual and the forecast, and I allocate it out to everybody across the year-long transaction volume. I'm not a big fan of that because then you are potentially doing an additional cost shift. And then the true-up mechanism is a chasing your tail type of mechanism. Because I would have to, as I resettle the T3, T72, T12 months, then any of those numbers change, then that year end is going to change, and there's interest related to it. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to highlight some of the benefits. I think I just kind of did. The benefits of the actual converted right. It's based on the collection and distribution is based on what actually was converted and not what was forecast to be converted. You are assigning it, like before, to volume measured transactions, assuming that the benefits across the EDAM footprint. It goes back to assures TSP and PTOs are not harmed by releasing bucket 3 transmission. And as I stated, it recognizes the shared benefit. Now, what I will do in the next couple days is I'll create a BAA by BAA specific examples like this, and we can compare them in either another opportunity or you can compare it on its own. Any additional questions?
And I don't see any individuals in the queue or the chat. Please proceed.
So we go on to the next slide. And this basically was another question, that's the questions that I want us to be able to think about when we're discussing this mechanism. One is, are we going to limit the converted TR revenues to the EDAM market, or are we extending this all the way through into WEAM? And the reason why I'm asking this is a couple reasons. One is the BAA, until everybody is in EDAM, you are potentially going to have a footprint change between EDAM and WEAM. So the question is, what do we use, what do we consider when we are, one, doing the transaction volumes, two, what is, if we do that second option where I do the actual converted TRRs, am I limiting it to day ahead transfers, gross export transfers? And we also want to think about this as the fact that TSP, the transmission service providers, based upon our current design, is once the day ahead market closes, that transmission is reopened up for sales between day ahead and real time. So does it make sense to look at going all the way to real time and include real time in this calculation as well? Currently, the WEIM design is that all of the transmission is being offered at basically a hurdle-free rate. It's reciprocity is the agreement for WEIM, and do we want to maintain that reciprocity, or do we want to provide the opportunity for recovering some of that revenue? And so then, if so, then should we include the real-time export transfers in the actual converter rights? And so if we decide, though, however, that we don't want to go all the way through to real-time into meter, then we will be having to limit this on as related to day-ahead schedules. And if we limit it to day-ahead schedules, does convergence bid, particularly convergence demand or supply, play a role in the allocation methodology? Now, I'm leaving those out there for thoughts. We can discuss them now, or we can, you guys can think about it and provide, let us know what you think. So I'm going to open it up for questions or comments here. I see Jeff, you have jumped in.
Jeff Nelson,
Appreciate
SCD. Thank you again. Thank you again. So yeah, I'm not sure I have a specific comment on how to or what to do different with WEIM versus EDAM, but our general proposal was that you sort of figure out historic revenue, and that includes all revenue, right? Including revenue that may be happening, right before the real-time delivery, and you use that as the benchmark. And then to figure out what the uplift is, once again, you consider all the revenue that you got, including stuff that happens between EDAM and WEIM if people are buying that. You sort of subtract that off of your benchmark and just make yourself whole. So I'm not sure I have a good answer on WEIM treatment, but I do think as a principle, any revenue you get anywhere goes to reduce the amount you're able to bill as uplift.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your response, and I think I know which direction that applies. Doug Boccioni, I see you're next in raising your hand.
Yeah, Doug Boccioni for BAMX. I just think that you want consistency between the markets. So I think if you did it a different way in the WEIM from the EDAM, that could potentially create problems. And then just a comment on the earlier slides about the cost allocation, and, sort of how to align that with the benefits. One of the concerns I have is that, if you look at EIM benefits, the ISO gets around, 20% of the calculated EIM benefits. And if the EDAM benefits were similar proportions, you could see the mismatch, right? If these costs are allocated on a load share or a load and generation share, most of the costs will go to the ISO, at least if the benefits allocation is similar to the EIM. That seems to create a potential mismatch.
Okay. Thank you. I'll note that, and we'll discuss that further.
Yeah, and I guess, and we'll talk tomorrow about the benefits allocation, I guess.
Yeah, because the discussion tomorrow is part of the discussion tomorrow, what is transfer revenue. So I appreciate that. So I see Carly Page also raised her hand.
Hi, my name is Carly Page. I work for the Nevada PC, and I apologize if I just missed this. It's a lot of information.
Oh, yes.
I'm still kind of trying to figure out practically speaking, where these dollars are going. And I think this is probably related to how exactly you defined metered demand. And I'm wondering which entities exactly are recovering these costs, who's paying them, and what venue are you using? So I'm in a PUC, right? So like, is my utility going to show up at the PUC and say, I need to pay this bill for transmission to make sure that Jeff is made whole? Or is it, yeah, I just want to make sure that I understand the process. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So what will happen is, and I kind of put PTOs in there and TSPs because for ISO, our PTOs, we're going to have to calculate the wheeling. And it would be loss, what we anticipate to be lost wheeling revenue. Each EDAM entity or transmission service provider within the EDAM footprint, so it could be Nevada would calculate what its short-term and non-firm sales are from the prior year, and it would anticipate or forecast how much of those sales it is currently getting that they potentially are going to lose as part of the joining the EDAM. And so we're trying to create a mechanism to allow Nevada to recover those costs and not be harmed by joining EDAM. And so we've created two potential mechanisms. Now, what this means is if we do it by a BAA by BAA rate, it's going to have a different BAAs are going to pay for Nevada's lost revenue, and similar, Nevada is going to pay for, it could be ISO, could be Idaho, whichever EDAM BAAs are joined. So you're going to have this whoever, if we do it by BA rate, it's a much more complicated solution and does not take into consideration the shared benefit of all that transmission. So what we're looking to do is potentially do a EDAM area rate, and then that says that this is the amount of revenues we have to recover across the entire footprint. This transmission is being used to serve any load. It could be load anywhere. And so therefore, we're going to recover it from Nevada's or all the BAAs within EDAM and pay Nevada to make sure Nevada's made whole from the transmission perspective, but the load is the one that's going to pay for it. So I think this was highlighted earlier, is that Nevada's load may potentially pay a little bit for the Nevada's TSP for in recovery, but everybody else is paying for the balance. Same thing occurs in all the other BAs as well, because we are having a shared benefit and we're trying to share the uplift to ensure that all the BAs are made whole. I'm hoping that answered your question.
Thanks. I think that's helpful. I guess, practically speaking, are you trying to flow the recovery through the FERC transmission rate or through individual LSCs or market participants?
So the settlements our settlement system will basically collect it from the LSCs and then pay the PTOs, and the PTOs or TSPs can use that to offset the FERC transmission revenue rates. Now, one of the other discussions that we're going to talk about tomorrow was, I think Jeff raised it and Doug raised it, whether or not the transmission revenue should also be used to offset the transmission revenue requirement.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then I see after Callie Wells is up next.
Hi, James. This is Callie Wells with WPTF. I just have a very basic clarifying question. So I thought I understood what you meant by converted TRR revenue at the beginning of the presentation, but now I'm kind of questioning my initial understanding. So by converted TRR, do you mean the lost revenues or the foregone revenues that transmission service providers potentially lose by making all of their bucket 3 capacity available to the market, or is it the foregone revenues that's associated with the bucket 3 transmission they make available to the market that's actually scheduled by the market?
So it's a combination. So depending upon which methodology we had talked about. So the forecasted is the transmission, and when they turn over the transmission, what they expect to lose to the market, either directly or indirectly. And they're still going to be making sales, and so whatever the TSP is going to have to estimate how much sales they're going to continue to make of short-term and non-firm sales, and then what they believe that the market is going to use instead. And this is, so you take your historic, and let's say it was 50,000 megawatts of capacity. And they determine, well, we're still expecting to sell 30,000 of it. So then the forecast is based on the 20,000 megawatts of transmission that they believe the market is going to use, or they're going to lose to the market instead of being able to do the bilaterals, collecting through the bilateral sales. Where the actual comes in is, now I look to see is, of that total 50,000, did you lose 20, or was it more 25,000 that you lost? And so we're trying to do potentially a true-up mechanism. So that's where the true-up mechanism has to come in place, is whether or not it's a true-up by the transmission service provider, or it's a true-up within the settlement system. And if we do the first methodology, what's going to have to happen is the transmission service provider is going to have to look to see what I estimated my sales was going to be and say, did I sell more or did I sell less? If I sold more, then I potentially have to adjust my forecasted converted TRR amount. If I sold less, I may have to adjust it up. So at that point, they potentially can carry that over in the next year or refile with the ISO. And so then at that point, we would go and collect the forecasted TRR. And this point would be a trued up actual at that point. Does that help, Kelly?
I think so. So it never really comes into play, or maybe I missed where it comes into play, that let's say they forecasted they were going to lose 20,000 megawatts of capacity. What if the market actually only scheduled on 15,000 megawatts? Does that ever come into play, or is that the additional 5,000 megawatts?
That's the additional 5,000 megawatts. They have to, so if we, in the first one, if we collected the 20,000, only used the 15,000, but they didn't sell it in the bilateral market, they're already pretty much made whole, because their estimate was from the prior year, and this is what they estimated to lose. So that year, that 5,000 at that point becomes implicit loss use of transmission. For the actual, what we are actually doing is adjusting that. So we are saying that, you anticipated that you would lose 20,000. You actually only lost 15,000. So we're going to calculate the collection on that 15,000, and we're going to pay out. So you're going to be short. So at that point, the transmission service provider has one of two options, or actually three options, but mainly one of two. They can either refile, adjusting their forecasted to be 20 to be aligned with the 15, and that way there is no shortfall surplus. So you would take in essence, you take the 20,000 megawatt, you would be adjusting your gross export transfers. so that they're in alignment, and therefore you would fully recover your lost or your converted TRRs, or you carry it over to the next year and you say, okay, I got to make an adjustment that I need to collect a little bit more last year to make up for what I lost the previous year. Does that make sense?
Okay, it does. I'll think through that a little bit more. I'm sure I'll have some follow-up questions. But so if you use the actual approach, does that require the market optimization to distinguish between when the market uses bucket 3 transmission versus bucket 1 and 2?
At this point, you would, yes, because we would have, because that is what the converted TRR rate is based off of. You have to determine what is the bucket 3 transfers or the unscheduled transfers that need to be recovered.
Okay, and at some point in time, are we going to talk about, I know this is getting more into the weeds of the actual optimization, but if we go down that route and we have to be able to identify transfers that uses bucket 3 versus 1 and 2, I think there's a question there as whether or not we assume that all 3 types of buckets are used in an equal fashion, meaning if there's a total of 300 transfers, it's 100 to bucket 1, 100 to bucket 2, and 100 to bucket 3, or does the market fill up first bucket 1 and 2 and then only move to bucket 3? I'm not sure if that's a question that we're planning on addressing either today or tomorrow, but if we can at some point talk about that, I think that's something that we need to discuss.
Okay. Yes, and from a theoretical, I would expect, since bucket 2 is being, transmission customers using for their own rights first, I would assume that, just thinking out loud, bucket 1 and bucket 3 would be used first, and then any unscheduled for bucket 2 would potentially be the last one we may want to consider. But that is, you're right, is an optimization discussion we need to probably have.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't know, okay. I think, Carly, your hand was still raised, but you could take it down. Is there any other questions or any questions in the chat?
Hey, James, this is Milos with the ISO, and maybe based on that last discussion, I could just jump in and you tell me, I'm trying to simplify this a bit so that others maybe follow as well, and let me know if I'm off. But ultimately, the intent with these approaches that we've outlined is to keep the EDAM entity whole from a historical transmission revenue perspective. So the intent would be under either of these approaches that I think what James was noting is that there's a forecast of the potential foregone transmission revenue that may consist of potential short-term firm transmission foregone revenues or non-firm transmission revenues. And the intent would be is that entity then, through this mechanism and the couple of different approaches that we've outlined, the entity is able to recover those historical, that anticipated foregone revenue requirement. And then what James was also talking about was, well, one thing that we could do is also true it up to actuals, at the end of the year or at some or a particular period and see, since entities are continuing to make transmission sales under their open access transmission tariffs, there could be some differentiation that, the forecasted amount may not ultimately be accurately represent what actually occurred at the end of the year. You could over-collect based upon the amount of owed sales or under-collect, and so that forecasted revenue requirement may need to be trued up based on the actuals that occur at the end of the year. You could have your forecasted foregone revenue requirement could have been more or could have been less, and that's where James was walking through different ways that then you could true this up at the end of the year. You could carry the surplus or the deficit into the next year. You could true it up at the end of the year compared to actuals, and there may be other mechanisms. But the intent under either of these approaches to ensure that historical revenue recovery and that foregone transmission revenue requirement that may have been forecasted. So did I capture that, James, kind of in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's a very good summary, Milos. You did my work for me. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions in the queue or on the chat. So if we move next slide, I believe I'm handing this back to Partha. I'll just skip this. We already discussed this. So let's this one as well. Sorry, I discussed it during the questions. I think we're back to you, Partha.
That sounds great. If you want to go back 2 slides, one of the good things about this is we're really sort of teeing up some of the questions that we had earlier in terms of sort of what are those sort of fundamental questions when we're sort of evaluating the merits of these different proposals. We kind of teed up 6 different questions, and that these slides that are remaining really are kind of allowing for more of a discussion and sort of re-teeing up those topics to get your all's feedback on kind of the how you all sort of see these questions and sort of or how do you view the proposals? And a lot of these questions there's different questions that you all want to consider. So I think before we move forward, maybe I'll open it up, and if you wouldn't mind flipping back one more slide. Yeah, thank you. So before we get to this, I'll just sort of say I'll add one more question, mainly because I think this was sort of a theme we heard from multiple participants, which was really the way I would describe it is kind of the merits of having a uniform versus a VA-specific transmission rates, and sort of is there really a need to focus on ensuring that, in effect, a BAA is not being really allocated a significant amount of their own costs. But I think this is sort of what Jeff Nelson from SCE, and there's at least one other party kind of brought up. There's different allocation mechanisms such that that's not really being a significant portion. So if anyone has any more thoughts on that type of allocation, I certainly would like to hear more people's perspectives on that issue. And I won't go through each one of these in detail, mainly because we just really had a robust discussion on this. But if there's any more discussion on transfer revenues, I might highlight the fact that there's really going to be a more of a robust discussion tomorrow on these topics, as James alluded to. But if anyone has any additional feedback for this discussion, I'd be interested in hearing it. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide.
Maybe part of this is Milos. If we could just stay maybe for a moment on that slide, I just want to make sure that folks have an opportunity, if anybody wants to share their perspectives on this. The idea here is, again, as Partha noted, that some of the transfer revenues that we'll talk about how those accrue, we'll talk about that tomorrow. But to the extent that those accrue associated with bucket 3 transmission, that short-term firm transmission that hasn't been sold by the transmission provider that's made available to the EDAM, the thought is that in the context of the prior discussion that James was leading, is that those revenues, those transfer revenues that accrue, could also factor into offsetting that historical transmission revenue requirement that may need to be recovered through the EDAM. And therefore, at the end of the year, there's a smaller, or at the end of a period, there's a smaller amount of revenues, ultimately actual revenues, that needs to be recovered through the EDAM. It's all contributing, along with the continued sales of out transmission, it's contributing to decreasing that amount of the historical revenue requirement shortfall, or that converted TRR revenue that may need to be recovered through the EDAM. Because I think the goal is finding ways to make that as small as possible. That's where the OAT sales continue, and that's where the thought here is, instead of this potentially going back to the transmission provider to utilize, and, how are they deemed to offset other costs, should this go to offsetting that historical transmission revenue that's foregone, that converted TRR that at the beginning of the year may have been forecasted to be recovered through the EDAM.
Thanks, Bill. I see David Rubin has his hand raised.
Yeah, I guess I won't be on the phone tomorrow, so I will just leave you with this thought that we're asking those transfer revenues to work pretty hard. I thought we were using them primarily so that we could make the bucket 2 unscheduled transmission available to the market, and then if the customer used it intraday, we would use the transfer revenues to hold them harmless. That to me seems like the best use of that money. And then obviously if there's anything extra, we can allocate it as an uplift in that time to measure demand. But I think using it in this way is going to conflict with that.
Yeah, and thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, I would agree to the extent of those transfer revenues, they could go to offset some of those potential bucket 2 issues that we talked about last week. So appreciate that perspective as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe David, I could just follow up and ask: is your key point that basically in the prioritized order, it sounds like sort of the first level of allocation would go to, in effect, bucket 2 transmission and ensuring that those customers are held harmless? Is that sort of the?
That's exactly right, Parker. And maybe at some point we'll get away from buckets and just talk about scheduled use and unscheduled use, and then allowing customers to continue to make intraday changes like they can under the out today. But I think you phrased it really well, that the congestion revenues or transfer revenues, whatever term we want to use, would be to hold those customers who actually schedule during that hour harmless.
Thank you, David. Yeah, really appreciate your weighing in.
Hello, this is Vijay with WI again. I have to confess that I had to drop off for like about 45 minutes, so I missed some of the nuances. But I want to come back to a big picture if you're trying to move on to the next topic, which I think I alluded to at the beginning of the session as well, is I totally recognize the need to try to find ways to create some kind of a incentive mechanism for bucket 3 to ensure that the not utilized transmission can be effectively used and justified. But I'm hoping, and as it's also indicated in one of the slides, this is supposed to be a near-term solution. That's a question. Is this a near-term solution, or we're going to be locked in with some kind of a, I'm calling compensation mechanism forever? Because the whole point was to efficiently use bucket 1 and bucket 2, and ideally there'd be the least available ATC that could be available as needed. So long story short, I hope there will be a glide path to eliminating this in the long term, or we're always going to be dependent for all forms of revenue to justify all kinds of investments. There's just a big picture comment. I didn't know where to place it. Thank you.
No, that's helpful, and yeah, really appreciate that perspective. Great. I think we have one more call.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, this is Rohan Chatterjee from Pacific Corp. I'm trying to understand the second approach a little bit better, the actual converted TRR revenue. And just kind of thinking this through, is the concept over here really that it is building in the forecasted gross export transfers and the actual gross export transfers to be able to calculate the actual gross transfer revenue, whereas the previous approach, the forecasted converted TRR, is completely oblivious of any forecasted or actual gross export transfers? Question mark.
So yeah, Rohan, this is James Lynn. Yeah, so the first option where we're just allocating the forecasted converted TRRs, you're not taking into consideration what was the actual converted megawatts. So what what was actually used by the market to use that transmission. And the second one, you're trying to true it up. You basically, this is what my estimate is. This is my estimated transfers. So I can now come up with a rate and I apply it to my actual. So when your actuals are different than your estimates, you are you're going to either wind up with a surplus or shortfall. But it gives you a better idea of what was actually used by the market versus being agnostic to what was used by the market.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's helpful, James. And so basically, you are using the forecasted converted TRR revenue and the forecasted gross export transfers to essentially calculate a forecasted converted rate, which, if I understand correctly, you are then applying to the actual gross transfers to calculate an actual gross transfer revenue. Is that right?
Yep. And then we're allocating out that actual gross converted transfer to volumetric transactions. So we're saying what you forecasted was you should have had this much revenue recovered based upon this much transfers. However, we said that, no, your actual transfers were different, so you're collecting this much money. We need to now then true it up. And how we true it up can either be done in one of three ways. And we highlight that either you could roll it over to the following year, you could resubmit your estimated gross export transfers to be equal to your actual gross export transfers, and then you'll then true it up all together through the settlement system, or we have a mechanism at the end of the year to true up any of those shortfalls or surpluses.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for the discussion and questions. Maybe we can flip to the next slide really quick, and don't feel like if anyone wants to weigh in on the previous topics, please feel free to do so. Another thing that we just really wanted to sort of tee up and make sure that people have the opportunity to provide more feedback on was really associated with the administrative processes in order to make this feasible and have confidence that, in the EDM marketplace, we're really factoring in, comparable bucket 3 transmission revenues. That kind of included maybe a discussion on sort of what data sources should be used. Are there really sort of common ways in which people will be looking at, particularly on the historical transmission revenues? Is there sort of apples to apples on sort of what that data would look like and how should it be used? And then if there's any feedback on sort of a little bit of review and documentation required in approving costs and what that process looks like. Maybe I'll pause here on this slide, but at least on these topics, I'd be interested if there's any feedback or thoughts that folks had on these topics before we move forward. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Milos.
Sure. This is Milos. I'll just note a bit of context again on this and what we're ultimately getting at as well, and if anybody wants to share some perspectives on this. But as Partha said, how do we provide confidence ultimately in the data that's provided that's making up this larger converted transmission revenue requirement across the footprint that needs to be, across the EDM that needs to be effectively recovered? I think some thoughts that we've heard about include, ensuring that the documentation is provided and potentially approved by a local regulatory authority, whether it's the commission or somebody else. Another potential approach that could provide confidence in the data that's provided to us, if it's attested to and signed off by an executive at the particular organization that's submitting it, but we'd be curious if there are if stakeholders have any other additional thoughts on how do we provide confidence in these in the numbers that are ultimately being provided, and anything related to that administrative process that we should think about if we ultimately do move forward with this type of approach, because we recognize there's going to be a number of different balancing authority areas that are in the EDAM, and how do you ensure that the appropriate costs are ultimately being submitted for recovery. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, we'd certainly appreciate hearing from you.
No, thanks, Milos. And maybe we can move forward, and if anyone else wants to weigh in, feel free. We can come back to this topic as well. And just to maybe set expectations, this next slide is actually our last slide for discussion. And really, a lot of this has really sort of been teed up both by participants and the earlier discussion, just in terms of how should this recovery of transmission values, both in terms of the usage and the revenues, as well as the allocation process, how might that evolve over time? There's kind of a couple topics that were brought up that we might want to hear further discussion on. One was, in terms of, new transmission build-outs and the evolution, are there ways that the bucket 3 transmission cost recovery should reflect those transmission investments and then recovery for those in the market? And the second one is really sort of along use factors. We heard from some participants who are suggesting, maybe what we really need to do is evolve to have this recovery type mechanisms go away over time. We also heard from some participants earlier that it might be the case where this is sort of recognized as more of a short-term mechanism, but then it might need some sort of true-up process over time. So it might be sort of just a future. I think what they're alluding to is, in effect, this might work for the first 3 years. This might be something that would need to be revisited from a policy standpoint going forward, particularly if there was significantly different uses of the system to where there might be some equity issues going forward. So, at least I'd be interested in hearing more from other folks, just in terms of if there's any sort of final comments on this issue, just in terms of the evolution of this recovery process. I see Jeff Nelson's weighing in. So this is great.
Hi, Jeff again from SE. Sorry for having the mic so much, but you do need to think sort of longer term, especially if transmission is still allowed to be marketed by BAAs, that if there is a significant change in use case, that they'll wind up selling the transmission rather than having it be part of the EDAM market and part of the optimization. So it does seem like something in the long term needs to be kind of like how we do TAC and wheeling today, that there's some sort of revenue that flows back to the transmission owner, and then they can just sort of use that to offset their FERC rates. So I do think the longer term solution looks a lot more like the wheeling revenues we have in place today for the ISO. Actual money becomes based on actual flows.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in effect, there would be something where maybe I'll see if I'm reading between the lines, Jeff. If at the start we might look back at historical and sort of say this is sort of the baseline in terms of under your proposal, but like over time it might need to evolve to look at sort of a more prescriptive one on sort of what flows are actually happening and who's actually in what's that associated transmission that needs recovery, and who should be paying for that? Is that getting at your arguments, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, so how we do in the ISO, we kind of figure out our transmission revenue requirement, kind of assuming that there's no wheeling at all. And then we use the wheeling revenue as a credit to sort of reduce that transmission revenue requirement. So, if all of our wheeling stopped, all of our transmission revenue requirement would be collected from our customers. And if wheeling increases, we actually collect less from our customers. And I just think in the EDAM framework, because people still have the option to sell it, that we need to come up with something in equilibrium that kind of makes them indifferent on whether they sell it or turn it over to the market. And that's probably some sort of flow-based compensation.
No, thanks, Jeff. That's helpful feedback. Any other questions or comments in the chat that I've missed?
There are no additional callers in the queue or any comments or questions in the chat at this time.
No, thank you. Well, that ends my portion of the presentation. I know that I'm going to turn it back over, I believe, to Keone for some closing comments. But at least for my part, I really want to say, thank you for the active participation today, and I really appreciate everybody who submitted comments on this. We really did get some good feedback and good thought processes in terms of how you all are looking at the trade-offs and various options we should consider going forward. So yeah, really appreciate the discussion, and unless someone else from the ISO has other feedback or wants to weigh in, I'd turn it back over to Keone.
Thanks, Partha. I'm going to turn it over to Ellie.
Thank you, Keone and Partha. Next slide, please. One more slide. Thank you, Candace. As for the next steps, we will hold an additional EDAM workshop tomorrow, July 20th, which will be virtual from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific time, and will focus on transfer revenue and rent allocation. And next week, we will hold 2 workshops on July 26th from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Mountain Time, and July 27th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Mountain Time, both in person and virtual, in Salt Lake City, Utah, to focus on confidence in transfers, GHG accounting, day-ahead RSC, and transmissions. And if you plan to attend the July 26th through 27th EDAM workshops in Salt Lake City, Utah, please register by Thursday, July 20th. Next slide, please. The ISO is pleased to be hosting the Stakeholder Symposium in person at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th. Registration is now open and available on the Stakeholder Symposium webpage under the Stay Informed tab on the CAISO.com website. And if you have any questions regarding the symposium, please feel free to contact us at symposiumred@CAISO.com. Thank you for joining today's discussion. Have a great rest of your day. Operator, you may now conclude the call.
Concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.